Good morning, everybody. We're going to give it a few minutes and start after the top of the hour as people join. As I see folks joining, hello, good morning. If it is morning where you are, we're going to give it a few minutes and start just a couple after the top of the hour so people have a chance to join. Hi, Alicia. Hi, folks. I see more people joining. We're going to give it just like probably 2 or 3 more minutes before we get started so everybody has a chance to log in. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are so happy to have you all here this morning for us. I'm curious what time it is where you are, to talk about building AI foundations. So we'll give a quick introduction for who we are, why we're talking about this, an overview of what we mean when we're talking about foundations. It's not necessarily something everybody is talking about when it comes to AI, so what are we saying? Some ideas about how you would get started, and then we're going to use a lot of the time for questions and answers. So please be thinking about them, be ready to share them, because I think it'll make it a lot more fun.
And so Gary, Sarah, and I will quickly introduce ourselves. But while we're doing that, it would be great if everyone could put in chat your location and your role. So while you all are typing, I'll get us started off here on the panelist side. I'm Connor Cantrell. I'm an information architect at Factor. I have been for the past 2.5 years. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Sarah Barrett. I'm also an information architect at Factor.
Great. I'm Gary Carlson, information architect and one of the founders at Factor.
Awesome. I think while folks are putting in their intro info in the chat, We can start with our next chat activity, which is we'd love to know how AI projects you've been working on have been going. So on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being like no success, complete failure, 5 being, complete success, exceeded expectations. Oh, did we go back to the previous slide?
Oh, did I? Sorry.
No worries. Um, so on a scale of 1 to 5, we'd love to know how your AI projects have been going. If you haven't had a chance to work on an AI project, you can also just put in 0. Okay, seeing some number. Okay, we got a good range coming in. I see a 2 and a 0 and a 4. Another 2. That's great, actually, if we have a range of experiences here, especially when we get to the Q&A portion. Seeing a lot of 2s. Yeah, I feel like that's really common right now.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and I think that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about and why we're focusing so much on foundations is what does it mean to get past that 2 stage and actually have something that's folks can get excited about past the pilot phase.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to move on. Thanks everybody for letting us know where you're at. Um, And just real quick, for those who are not familiar, our perspective when we're talking about these AI foundations really comes from the work we've done with large enterprises and seeing the importance of building these foundations, not just for AI, we've been doing this for a while, but for other top line capabilities and really have these foundations serve as a basis for the way the organizations run.
And it can be an interesting thing to try to diagnose in an organization sometimes because I feel like we've seen this with information architecture for a long time where people very rarely are like, there's a problem with our information architecture unless they're already kind of read into the space. Instead, we get more kind of nebulous pains. And I think we're seeing this with AI projects also. We're hearing things like, hey, none of our reports are aligning. My team can't find the things that they need. We're getting in arguments over what things are called and we can't ship things. Like, how do we even think about quality or, whether it's correct in a thing like this? So the feeling that things just kind of are out of sync is frequently an indicator that there's some kind of deeper information architecture problem with those foundations.
And so when we're talking about foundations, I'm going to have a couple slides here, really just to sort of set the stage for what we're talking about. And again, this has come from our work with a lot of large enterprise type projects. But these foundations fundamentally support top line capabilities, whether it's analytics, personalization, knowledge management. Obviously, right now, top of everyone's mind is AI readiness. In our mind, these foundations to make these projects successful, not just at the pilot phase, but at the actual operational phase year after year, requires this notion of organizational alignment, really understanding your users, both the internal users who need to generate content and use content and make decisions, as well as your customers and partners or regulatory bodies that you're working with. Governance is a huge part of this foundation, and it's something that needs to be built in at the beginning and can't really be bolted on at the end. How do we make changes? How do we agree on what something is? How do we distribute it across the organization? Technical readiness and workflows too, both very, very important parts of building this foundation. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today.
So at Factor, one of the most effective frameworks I think we have to build those foundations of data quality is this notion of layers in a digital experience. There's a lot of versions of this diagram or this concept out there, so you're probably already a little familiar with it. But basically, we think of, the different layers. There's the experience layer, which is some of those front end experiences that the users are interacting with, like, your resource portal on a website, your API endpoint they're calling. There's the technical layer that's kind of the back end stuff. Those are your systems and integrations. But Factor, our work really lives in what we call the information layer, which some folks also call the semantic layer. And we really see this as a connective tissue between the experience and technical layers. So the way this might work in an AI project, for example, is like, say you have a user entering a prompt in the LLM, that's kind of the experience layer. You could have some sort of semantic metadata or a context graph workflow that represents the information layer. And that mediates and refines that natural language query the user is putting in before it hits that like vector space, the technical layer, for example. And this is a kind of model we've already seen improve performance at other clients.
So another way of looking at that is, and this is really sort of blows out the what Connor was talking about there, is that, fundamentally organizations need to execute on these top line business capabilities. These are the types of things that executives are using to, drive sales, customer satisfaction, those executive concerns. And so, being able to do enterprise analytics on campaigns or product performance and stuff like that, the customer experience, personalization, all of those things are these top line capabilities that fundamentally depend on a unified understanding of your information. Now, each of those capabilities will have some form of endpoint, as Connor was talking about. It might be a dashboard, it might be another surface somewhere, it could be a reporting tool. Whatever that is, those endpoints are generally collecting information from multiple systems. So you see the technical layer down below, we've got a number of systems, and it's this information layer, the semantic layer that Connor was talking about, that allows you to stitch these things together. And I'll give you an example of what that looked like when we did a project for a large manufacturing company. And they were spending billions of dollars on marketing, but could not really run campaign analytics because they had so many systems involved. And so as we built out that information layer, we helped them model what their customer was, different taxonomies that needed to support their business and their products, and then really worked with them on the governance work so that when they were doing the enterprise analytics, their experience layer, the e-commerce sites, the analytics dashboards, and some of the enterprise applications could draw consistent information from all the different technical systems that were involved. And that's really what we're talking about with this foundation, is be able to create these models and manage them and have them exist within your organization consistently so that these capabilities can be executed on and so that your AI projects have a common framework from which to work. And one of the primary goals for this is really um, data quality. One of the things we're finding over and over, and I'm sure you've read plenty about in the press as well, is just how with artificial intelligence, it's working at such scale and such speed that if your data is not aligned to your business needs, if your data quality isn't good, those problems just get exacerbated by the AI because it's able to move so quickly and so fast. So by building this foundation layer, by building these foundations, it allows you to not only have better data quality, but the data quality will also be aligned with what your needs are, and support those capabilities and support you as an organization and your customers themselves. So the data quality itself is going to drive the AI accuracy, precision, and the efficiency. The more consistent the information is across your different systems, the less work it takes for the AI to start pulling these things together.
So everything we've been talking about so far is really in service of these core four foundations. We have stability, which is the ability to reliably build and maintain solutions on your data. User focus, discovering and meeting your users' needs. Modeling, so that's the structured information like your taxonomies, your content models, your site architecture, and so forth. And then alignment, which is where we create those cross-functional norms and agreements. So these probably sound pretty familiar to you because these have been really core pillars of information architecture and data governance practices for decades. It's no coincidence that working on these foundations tends to create benefits beyond your AI mandate. That being said, there are some intricacies to AI that are kind of newer and more unique, like deciding how your data model will support both tagging and agentic reasoning use cases, or figuring out how your content model needs to be adjusted to support your GEO or AIO metrics. And those do require some deeper understanding of the domain. I also want to call out that stability and organizational alignment in particular, I think can be really intimidating because a lot of us work at organizations that are just constantly changing, right? There's staff turnover and always a new initiative and general information overload. And the notion of somehow creating stability and alignment in that is really daunting. Um, Often it's really productive to design with those constraints in mind. And Sarah actually has a great analogy about that, so someone should ask her about it during the Q&A portion. To be a little cliche, I think these foundations are often more about the journey than the destination. You can't always wait to act until you have everyone's buy-in or the perfectly rationalized model. Sometimes you're being judged on your ability to ship something fast. And there are steps you can start taking today to mitigate that risk and get you on the road to a more mature and aligned information environment. And Gary's going to start telling us about those.
So actually building out these foundations and having them be a program and actually embedded in the core of your organization is a lot of, as Connor said, it's a journey. But that's not to say there aren't things that can be done right away. Even if you don't have the full executive mandate or understanding of what's necessary, or even if some of your systems are a little bit old and out of date, or you don't have the technical resources to do some updates. But what we have found is that there's just really, some fundamental things that can be done. And I know there's a lot of text on the slide. We will be sharing these, so don't worry about, having to read all of them. And I'm just going to go through a couple of the highlights of what can be done. The first is just figuring out how to enhance your information consistency. How do we make sure that when we're describing like the notion of industry or geography or audience, we're doing that the same way in multiple systems, and driving consistent tagging, so that anytime a customer or a product white paper or other piece of content is tagged with an industry, we're using that same list. Just driving that consistency can be a huge benefit for the AI models. Um, and that type of work can be done, if you're just doing your work at your AI right now, working with a couple different systems, that can be done today. Doing it across the whole enterprise, again, that turns into more of a program. But these are the types of things that can start today, and you'll see real success. Um, and then enabling better discovery and retrieval. Again, work we can do here is just starting to organize and rationalize your metadata and your AI frameworks. Having a common model for your customer, for your products, for what a sales process looks like, and sharing that metadata across those different processes, workflows, and systems. And sometimes that's really just having a meeting where saying, hey, this is what we mean by a product, and these are the attributes associated with it. Sometimes you're able to actually define those attributes more coherently and make sure they're represented the same way in different systems. But just starting that conversation can be very helpful. Because then when you're doing AI or when you're doing personalization or dynamic content distribution or any of those things, you've got a common foundation, common framework for grabbing that information and reusing it. Um, both the information consistency and the retrieval will always benefit from having shared taxonomies, metadata. I think that's one of the things we've been talking about in these other ones as well, is having a common list of industries, common list of audiences, things like that, allows you to share it in these different systems so that when you train people to do the tagging or you build interfaces that allow you to do the consistent tagging, they'll all be drawing from the same list of terms to drive that consistency and building that stable foundation for you to build the AI products on top of. Um, and once you've done that, the idea of building out knowledge graphs might seem like a next gen type of thing. We just need to get our taxonomies in our different systems. But once you have your taxonomies, you can actually start building out some simple or basic knowledge graphs that are drawing relationships between the different terms and the different taxonomies and incorporating some of the content and start looking at some of those things to get started and start seeing value from that earlier than a lot of people anticipate. So I'm not saying that this is going to solve all your AI problems, but if you take nothing else away from this project or from this webinar today, hopefully there are a few things you think of start doing today. And then for the things that you can't do today, there's some questions I think you can start asking within your organization to hopefully start the conversation and get people thinking about what does it take to move ourselves forward. So we often think about this in this notion of alignment. How is the organization aligned to the strategy? Do you have the resources set up to support the strategy? Are job descriptions aligned with your strategy? Is the notion of this strategy has it has it left the executive realm and is it being embedded within the different business units? Um, and also the strategy to the data. You can start asking questions today about is our data fit for purpose for what we want to do with AI? If we're asking the AI tools to provide customer service in a chatbot, we should ask ourselves, is the data actually set up to do that? Do we have up-to-date information, product information for the chatbot? Do we know what version the different documentation of which version of our product the different documentation applies to? So when people are asking about it, we can make sure that we're answering the right question for that version, for the right version of the product. Those types of things, when you're looking at the strategy, pulling out and making sure that you've got the data to support it can start some really good conversations internally. Another set of questions you can start asking is the data really meet the needs of our users? Or is our data really just focused on our needs internally? And this is, again, will really help us understand, is the AI ready to start meeting the needs of your users? Or right now it's just ready to meet the needs of a pilot that demonstrates something within our organization. And then another place you can start asking questions internally is the data aligned with our technology? Are our taxonomies and metadata implemented in the different technology systems? Do we have the technology know-how to make sure that they're managed consistently? Can your technology even incorporate the notion of a taxonomy, shared metadata, ontologies, can it take advantage of the relationships we're creating between different terms or different concepts within the organization? And again, these are all, going to be, these are for longer term discussions. And maybe out of these questions, you'll find things that you can start doing today. And maybe some of these things need to be put on a more strategic roadmap. But again, coming out of what we're hoping today is that folks would see both some things they could start doing today, start tagging information consistently, sharing taxonomies, and starting the conversations that are going to allow your organization to really build these foundations and not and build your AI products that will survive past the pilot phase. And so that was a lot of content we wanted to cover today. We had envisioned this webinar based on some workshops that Sarah and Connor and I have done recently, as well as some work we've been doing with our clients. So there's been a set of consistent questions that have been coming up. And so we thought we'd start going through those. Before we start with some of ours, I'd ask folks if you have questions to start putting them in the webinar chat, and we can start answering those. And while people are putting those questions in, maybe we'll start with some of our questions that we've heard a lot of. One of the biggest questions is where do we start? Um, and how do we start building these foundations while also showing progress? Really common questions we get. Um, and so, Sarah, do you want to take it, swing at that one?
Sure. This is a question that I struggled with for a long time, and in a previous one of these that I actually did years ago with Dan Klein, somebody asked the question, and he had a better answer than I did, which I initially hated. So I'm going to tell you his answer and then why I think it was actually right, because it took me a minute to figure it out. Where he said that to figure out where to start with this kind of work, you want to look for places where complexity is being lost. And I had such an initial, like, visceral negative reaction to that because I was working at a big tech company at the time, and I was like, damn, I cannot sell complexity to these people. Everything I am being asked to do is to get rid of complexity and make things simpler. And I think I was right in that. But I've come to appreciate, because what he was really getting at, and I think which is true, what I think it is true in this case also, is we want to look for places in our organization where we as the organization know something that isn't being translated from place to place in our system. We know something about our how campaign works, that that campaign doesn't exist anymore, that that program isn't available for signups, that this isn't our event strategy right now, like whatever the thing is. We know something about how things work, the people involved know something about how things work that isn't getting moved from place to place. That knowledge isn't transferring with it. And that can be a really effective place to kind of grab onto something and say, like, ooh, this is a spot where our architecture is like that information layer is not serving us. It's fundamentally not doing what we need to do. The other way I like to think about this is through an idea of like windows of opportunity, which I think are often used quite generically, but I think they can mean something relatively specific, where all the time in an organization, if you're trying to make this kind of change happen, I think it's really effective to be thinking about the problems people are already bought in on. What is everybody already worried about? Does everybody agree that we can't tell, whether it makes, whether our marketing campaigns are having any impact? Do we all agree that it's a huge problem that we're having live site incidents all the time? Like, what is the problem that people already agree on? What are the solutions that people are bought in on? Generally speaking, in a lot of organizations right now, AI is a solution that has a ton of buy-in. If you say that AI can just do this, you don't usually have to argue that too hard right now, but it changes depending on organization. And there are other kind of solutions that tend to have buy-in. I've worked somewhere where the whole kind of founding myth of the organization was that we can treat documentation as code and that will work. And so approaches that use that solution had a lot of cachet. And then the kind of political layer. What is everybody worried about right now? Are we having layoffs and people are worried about their jobs? Is there a problem with the budget? What's going on that kind of is in the air? And thinking about where those three things align can give you a really powerful spot to aim this work, because it can often be hard to, one, choose where to start, like this question, and two, to make the work and the scope of change small enough to be persuasive to somebody. where it's like, what's going to happen when we do this foundation work? It's like, well, a lot of stuff. A lot of things will change if you really nail this. But if you can make that case and kind of target the first work you do in terms of the problems people are already bought in on, the solutions that seem persuasive, and pitch them to the political context of kind of where you are, there's a much easier way of getting started.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'd ask folks, listening in, if you want to type in anything in the chat, places where you've seen had success getting started, um, that would be great to hear that from everyone else as well. Um, Great. Well, we've got a couple more questions we'd like to go through, but again, please, if you've got questions about these foundations or how they work or where, how to use them, please put them in the chat.
Gary, there's a question in the Q&A portion.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Um, okay, so the question from Alicia was, you spoke about data quality and what happens when the data fits the pilot, but not the user's needs. The solution was built around structured data that they had thought that they had throughout the funnel. Um, my team was riffed before I got taken to clean up too. Um, yeah, so I think this happens a lot. You know, the data quality you need to support your pilot is not always the data quality you need or the data you need to go into production. I think that's one of the things we're seeing a lot of, and definitely one of the reasons we have focused so much on the foundations. We've seen so much written about, large numbers of AI projects not getting past the pilot phase, organizations seeing that there's too much risk with implementing them, stuff like that. And I think that that's an issue because they get to the pilot phase. The AI does an amazing job of getting you to like 80%. But getting to the point where you can actually use it to solve customer problems, make decisions, those types of things requires that additional work and that the foundations are going to provide. Um, yeah, and your comment, Alicia, too, is like the data didn't take into consideration um, what the sales team really needed or what was in their pipeline. And again, we see that a lot in these pilots. You plug something in, you get some results that look promising, and given the amount of effort you've put into it, it's like, hey, this is pretty good. We should keep going with this. But then you hit this wall without this foundation in place. So yeah, thank you for that question, comment. Um, yeah, yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to put it. It works in a pilot in part because a pilot tests the idea, but not the reality. I'm going to steal that if I can. Um, Great. Let's see. If there's no other questions coming from folks right now, we'll move to some of the others we have. But again, please feel free to comment uh, and or add questions. Who owns the foundations? Um, Connor, do you have any thoughts on this one? Or
I'm going to give a classic IA answer. IA answer, it depends. Um, this is where I think, to kind of Sarah's point about really looking at what's going on in your organization and thinking about the specific political complexities and where some of the like looking for where the complexity is living, I think becomes especially true because, right, who owns the notion of, like, for example, the information model, your taxonomies, ontologies, knowledge graphs? That could be, a director of data governance in one org. In another org, it could be just like an ad hoc working group. So I think, and again, I'm kind of cribbing off Sarah here. I think if you follow the kind of steps she laid out, that will lead you to understanding who owns the foundations and also what they care about. What are they incentivized to do or support or provide resourcing for? And I think that's a really great way to start.
Do you want to hear my kind of hot take here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I think this is rarely the way it's practiced, but like again, realistically, doing these things are foundations. They're called foundations. You're trying to like metaphorically stick it under the house after the house has been built. That's a hard thing to do. You need to do it from a leveraged position. And so, in my opinion, where this work needs to sit is where the locus of power in an organization is. And that depends a lot on an organization. Like, there are companies where everybody bows down before sales. There are companies that are very engineering focused. There are companies that are very product management focused, and they treat them as the CEOs of their own little empires. I think there are relatively few companies that are like really design focused, and the UX designers are like wielding absolute power, but they probably exist. And so I think a lot of the work of figuring out where you can really effectively do this work, which I think like dovetails nicely with what you were saying, Connor, but I think like a shortcut to it can be like who gets to just kind of make decisions and then see what these foundations do for those people so they can be situated in that context.
And the other thing I think organizations, as they're building these foundations, it's a new capability for them and a new way of thinking about it. And one of the problems I think they run into is they assume that it's almost a one and done type of thing. Oh, we've built it and we're good. Or they don't understand how much it permeates the organization. And so I think about it sometimes in the way of like how an organization approaches something like security, whether it's digital or physical or whatever. But at the end of the day, there's someone who owns that for sure. But maintaining a secure environment needs to be permeated throughout the entire organization. Everyone has to be thinking about it as they're entering the facilities, as they're using their computers, as they're using their phones and stuff like that. It has to permeate the organization. And I think this is one of those things as well that as it builds and the organizations start to see the value from it, maintaining the data, treating the data well, using it appropriately, all that needs to be something which starts to permeate the organization. Um, all right, so we have another question from Sharon Stern. Hello, Sharon. It says, one of your slides alluded to a common attitude that the AI will just magically create the structure it needs. So no investment in structuring data and content is needed. At this point in AI adoption, are you finding this attitude is still common? And what are some good strategies for moving people away from it?
I have a story about this.
Excellent.
So, at one of the clients I'm working with right now, several months ago, they started this big end user facing LLM project. So the idea was that end users for this design company would be able to go to their website and type into their chatbot and get answers on how to use the products. So the engineering team, spends however many months, spends their time designing it, and they release it live. And to Gary's point, AI can sometimes be really good at getting us like 80% accuracy. They weren't even seeing 80% accuracy there, right? Like it became kind of like five alarm fire, like, my client's boss's boss's boss was involved. And this client in particular, she has done heroic work over like 6 or 7 years, kind of maintaining this taxonomy data model area that we've been trying to get people to adopt. And she's been, it's been years, right, of kind of bringing it up in meetings and, letting people know what's happening. So when this crisis is happening, an executive goes, hey, are you using this data that this person keeps talking about? The engineers were like, no. Should we? So we started working with them to provide our data and to, it was basically the process I described earlier in the slides were right. Our taxonomy data, our structured data, our controlled vocabularies acted as this mediating layer between the natural language input and the vector space. And immediately we saw accuracy shoot up and the engineers were like, oh, wait, this data set, like this taxonomy thing actually really helps us. And this has actually led to um, being incorporated. We've worked on some MCP development projects. And I think the MCP in particular has been really helpful for making this case because I find a lot of my engineering partners understand that like the MCP itself, this protocol that is exposing data in a very specific way to agents, They understand that the MCP isn't creating the value of the data because they have their own data that they expose through MCPs. So that's also been, I think that MCP work in particular, we've been able to, it's been made really concrete to some of those folks with power at this client's org that like, oh, okay, the value of this taxonomy data that's solving some of these problems for us comes from those foundations we were talking about. It comes from the governance. It comes from having this rationalized model. And it's starting to shift the perception of my client's team. She's gotten dinged before for being told she's more of a research team instead of like the product focused team they want to see. But with the adoption of the product and these AI specific use cases, by just being willing to play ball and say like, hey, let's just like try using our data and see what happens. That has done a lot to shift the perception of not only the data itself, but also the team maintaining the data. So that's been really positive.
To generalize Connor's story a little bit, because it really dovetails nicely with something like what I've seen repeatedly, is I think you can do two things. One is that you can really go all in on evaluation. That's a thing that is tripping a lot of organizations up right now, is that the kind of where you allocate your effort in AI engineering projects is very different from a traditional engineering project, where, normally you go through a whole process and you build some things and you throw some tests on the end, and that's kind of your evaluation. And that is not how this works when you're working with with any kind of AI sort of product. You need to think about evaluation very early, and you're going to allocate a lot more of your effort there. And so I would say if you see an investment happening and you don't think it's going to work because they're not working with appropriately structured data, involve yourself in that evaluation process to start defining what good would be and how you're going to check. Because the things people come up with to check these things, wild. Like not very rigorous a lot of the time. And so then you can kind of be there going like, oh wow, crazy. That didn't happen. Huh, who could have anticipated that? Which can be very effective. And then the other thing, which I think they did in that story, which really made it work, was that they had data and a structure ready to go. Because it really doesn't work in very many organizations to say like, hey, no, you have to use my thing. And then the people ask like, what thing? You're like, give me 6 months and I will be right back. Like, you can't do that. So you have to have your structure and the things you want them to use your answer ready. And so if you can like let that boat scrape a little bit and say like, wow, the evaluation is really showing it's not working too well. And then why don't you use this? It's ready to go. That's a much more effective way of making the structure happen.
And a lot of this, I think, gets to this notion of what we were talking about earlier with why, the importance of stability. If we're going to test this work, if we're going to build these capabilities, having a stable platform to build them is really important. But if your data is inconsistent across your different systems and you create some AI, agents or whatever it is you're building, and it's getting different data from different systems or the data is not aligned well, it's really hard to build and test over and over again to refine them and get them to do what you want them to do. All right, we've got one more question here. Um, it says, how have you seen organizations address the accountability when that care needs to be permeate the organization? I'm seeing directives without guidance, guardrails, or punitive versus incentive sticks versus carrots. Um, I think there's two parts to answer that question for me. One of which is to work within the sphere of influence that you have. So we had one project where we had an executive VP who understood the importance of these foundations. So we were able to, and she understood what that mandate needed to look like, and so we were able to work very effectively with everyone who reported up to her. The systems, the business teams, and all of that stuff. It worked great. Every time we tried to cross that boundary out to some folks who didn't roll up to her, it got a lot more challenging. So, from the accountability perspective, one of which is to understand what accountability you even have to work with. So, if this is an initiative that's being run by a director who's arguing with other directors about what the right direction is to go, my advice would be like try and stick within your sphere of influence where you can get that sort of executive and strategic direction that will keep everyone moving in the right direction. For the bigger question, it's really, I think, about showing results and being able to show, hey, if we want to do this personalization, if we really want the to trust the results coming out of our AI chatbot, we need, we'll need to have these things in alignment. And I think that's a point where talking about risk can be really helpful. If we can say, hey, if we want to do this, here are the risks involved, not by not aligning ourselves to these AI needs. Again, but it's a really hard, squishy thing to address. I mean, it's a great question, but every organization struggles with this.
Well, and part of it also is that organizations earn their architecture, right? Through like
Yeah,
the quality of their communication, the quality of their decision making. And so the stuff I see this question talking about, you know, directives without guidance, punitive versus incentives, like that's all very characteristic of like a certain level of maturity of an organization, which is not really just about AI. It's not really just about incentives. It's about, management knowing how to do a certain set of things. And in that case, they're sowing things and they're going to reap them also. And so I think a lot of the question then becomes to achieve something substantially different, like Gary was talking about, you have to, they have to work differently.
yeah.
And that means that organization has to change. What leverage, if any, do you have to change how that organization works? Is that something that other people are seeing problems with, even if it's not related to AI or foundations or information architecture or any of those things? Usually, most people are not happy in that kind of a situation. When executives are issuing directives without guidance, it's usually not from a place of power and clarity. You know, and so there might be other currents that you can plug into.
I think that really gets to the heart of the matter for a lot, for AI success or other projects that are heavily dependent on, your organization's information. The technology is cool. It can do really cool stuff right away. But if you're really going to benefit from this, it's a people problem. It's an organization problem. Um, and uh, that's what, one of the big takeaways we've taken from seeing some of this. Yes, we can set up a pilot that will get some work done, but if we're really going to have this permeate the organization needs to be aligned around it. And the foundation is really one of those places where that can happen. Um, so I think yes, it is an organizational alignment, organizational change process, so for sure. Um, there's no magic AI pixie dust that's just going to solve your organizational problems as much as might tell you. Well, thank you for your questions. I think we're gonna wrap things up. The last slide we have is, I'm gonna put this up there because it's something we offer, which is this activator problem. But I think it's also something that you can just take to your organization and say, you know what, we need to get our ducks in a row. I mean, this is a service we offer, obviously, but internally too, you can say, you know what, let's just take a step back and let's spend 3 or 4 weeks really answering the questions that we need to answer about alignment, around who owns this, around what foundations we need, around what is the true value of these AI initiatives. And when we're working with it, I think this is a model that, has worked well for us and could work for you, but really spending some time looking at your content, your data, and how it needs to work together to solve the business problems you're trying to address. Um, the workshops themselves are extremely valuable, and I think the way this can work with your organization is it's a place just to get everybody talking. If we're going to have organizational alignment, organizational change, people need to align around what that change is, and that doesn't happen unless you can get people in a room, share perspectives, come to a common perspective, understand what the goals are, give the executive team an opportunity to really share the strategy and hear the feedback of what it's going to take to address that strategy, that type of work. And then coming up with a plan for the foundation. You're not going to be able to build this all in one day, in 1 week or a month. It's an ongoing process. But coming up with that plan that you can start working against is a great way to work, is a great way to get some of these things started. Um, so I'm hoping out of this webinar so far, you've come away with uh, a number of things you can start doing today. Start tagging things consistently. Let's start creating common taxonomies we can use and making sure they're showing up in the right places. That type of stuff. Um, and then I hope you also have a framework for asking some of these deeper questions of what it's going to take to align your organization to really have the data that's fit to purpose to support an AI initiative. All right. This deck will be available to folks after the webinar. And if there are any final questions, all right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I hope this was helpful. If you have any feedback or other questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Um, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.